Welcome back for this afternoon's sessions. This one is Suicide at Work, an expert-led journey from understanding to managing the effects. Nick Barnes, Chief Executive, National Centre for Suicide Prevention Training, is joined by Carrie, Birmingham, to discuss this difficult but critical topic. Thank you.
Right, well, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us in this post-lunch slump that often occurs. So, who am I and why have I got the right to have the stage today? So, my proudest role in life is mother of 2 dogs. In Game of Thrones style, it's not quite mother of 4 dragons, but I'm working on it. I'm a passionate camper, I'm a passionate yoga enthusiast, I'm also someone who loves to cook. In my professional career, I've worked as a HR director, and I was a HR director at News UK, the media company owned by Rupert Murdoch, accused of paying public officials and hacking phones for 10 years. And the reality, for me, meant that suicide became part of my life at that stage. And that's really what we're going to talk to you about today. So, having been the HR director for The Sun, I had 34 arrested employees, and so suicide became a reality that we had to face into, because when people are without purpose, when they're frightened about their future and they've experienced trauma, it's a reality that you may face. And so today, what I'm here to do is talk to you about my experience, my lived experience of dealing with that. I'm not here, just to be clear, I'm not a mental health expert. I'm not here to talk about suicide prevention. I'm here to talk about my lived and sort of personal experience of actually handling suicide in an organisation and what that means. I'm joined by Nick, who's also going to talk to you a little bit about suicide, and we've got some sort of slightly different views about this subject, and we hope that you'll enjoy the difference that we'll talk about. So, why do I have a right to talk about this? Well, unfortunately, I remember the day when I was stood in a room with 4 other board members, and one of those board members told us that, unfortunately, we'd lost a colleague to suicide. And I remember what it felt like to have all the other people turn to look at me and say, what do we do? If I'm honest, my first response was, what are you all looking at me for? I'm not a specialist. I haven't handled this before. Just because I'm in HR doesn't mean I know what I'm doing. I managed not to say that out loud. Probably one of my prouder moments. But what I was able to do is actually take a step back and think, well, actually, the reality is I do actually have a plan for this. So being the HR director for The Sun, as I say, where we had a lot of journalists who were at home thinking about their futures, a colleague and I actually sat in a room and actually looked at each other and said, I think today is the day we're going to have to talk about what we could face and what that would mean. And the honest truth is, as we wrote a plan of what we would do if it happened, we cried. Because we couldn't quite believe that our job had come to that that's the work that we were doing, and it certainly wasn't work we imagined we'd ever do. So the day when all of those people turned to me and said, and so what do we do now? Once I'd recovered myself, I was able to think, well, actually, I do have a bit of a plan for this, and maybe now's the time that I need to dust it off. It actually was a bit of paper I'd been carrying around in my pocket for quite a long time. And so today, I thought what I would share is, what are the 3 key lessons that I learned from dealing with those situations and all of the emotions they created in our workforce, in our executives, and in me as a human being, and what does that mean I can tell you? I've got 3 lessons, I suppose 3 key things I wanted to share with you, and I am going to give you an opportunity just for a moment to talk about it with a colleague. So as you look around the room today, find someone you'd like to have a conversation with, and be prepared to turn to them at some point when we get to those 3 lessons so that you can discuss them with each other. So, the first question, I suppose, and the first slide I've got here is whether you would know what to do if your phone rang and actually the person on the other end of the phone was telling you that a colleague had actually died through suicide. And that's the first thing, I suppose, that I wanted to talk to you about. Do you know what to do next? So, can you flip on a couple? These are the stats. Sorry, go back one. These are the stats. So the reality is, whilst not everybody in this room will face this reality, enough people take this route that actually it is a reality that many of us might face with our colleagues. And so I thought I'd just share some stats here from the Samaritans that really just remind us why this is a reality that could be in our lives. So if you think about that question, that next question, what is it that you would say if someone phones you to tell you that? Then the first lesson learned I had was that you need to think about choreographing your conversations. So what does that actually mean? Well, for me, it actually meant, firstly, pulling down the oxygen mask first myself. So if you think about going on a plane, that's the first thing they say is you can't help your children if you can't help yourself. And so when that phone call came and I actually had a conversation with an executive telling me that's what had happened, the first thing I did was take myself off to a private room. And to be honest, again, the first thing we both did was have a cry, because actually I needed to take care of myself first. Only once we'd done that were we able to think about what we did next. And in my case, I got 4 to 5 of my sort of core employees together in a room and shared the news that I'd just heard with them and had a conversation about what it meant and what that meant we needed to do next. What did I learn about that? I think it means that you need to be really clear about the person you're talking about. So the first thing is, what do we know about this person? In all of my cases, they were someone I knew personally. But in the team that I was with, the first question I'd ask them is, what more do you know about this person? What do we need to be thinking about right now? Who are their friends? Who are their family? What is their connection? Because if your organisation is anything like ours were, there was always connections to family, friends, in the people that we were about to talk to. And that's the first thing we paid attention to. We then started to think about the people we needed to tell, and for many of you that will mean you'll have to communicate up the tree in terms of letting people know. You will need to think about who you need to tell, both in your own team but also in the team affected. And as HR director, we essentially mapped out those conversations. And what we got really clear about is what we knew and what we didn't know. Because the first thing that happens when you give staff that news is they ask lots of questions. And at that point, you don't know the answer to many of them. You also need to think about in what format that you tell people. So in each case, I've chosen to tell people close to the employee in question on their own, if they were close, whether that's their line manager or their best friend at work, of which we often had one of those. We would always tell the team together, because that gave them the ability to talk to each other and share stories, and for them to share how they felt with each other. And usually the best friend was in the team too, so they would actually be part of that conversation despite having already been told. I got to understand that I also needed to consult people, so I needed to ask the question, who else do we need to think about? So who don't I know about? Who is it that we need to consider? Who's important right now that we need to talk to? The hardest bit, of course, is the conversations that you need to have with families, and certainly those are the ones that tested me the most, whether that was because they did or didn't want to talk to you, and I've had both reactions. So be clear what it is that you're going to say, think about the order in which you're going to say it, think about the environment that you're going to have that conversation, and only then are you ready to start thinking about going to talk to people. Each time, I remember the sense of feeling anxiety about wanting to go quickly, because I wanted to make sure that we told our staff before anyone else did. Because in many cases, there'll be connections between families and friends with other parts of the industry. I would caution you to take some time to do it at the speed that you know you can do it well, because that means you'll do it right. When it comes to families, what did I learn about that? There's an element of needing both formal and informal communication. So we did send a formal letter from someone senior, because I think that's something that people expect to see. And we did offer both face-to-face and telephone conversations if that's what families wanted. But be prepared for the questions that you'll get asked. I remember the first time, the one that caught me out is the question about payroll. So when does it stop? I would caution you to know the answer to that, as much as it wasn't the first thing that I thought about. It was part of that conversation. So that's some things I've learned about choreographing conversations. So, as I warned you, if you could find a partner, if we can flick on a couple of slides. Keep going. And again. So, what does this mean for you? So grab a partner, preferably someone next to you, 1 minute each way, a bit of pairs coaching. What does that idea of choreographing conversations mean to you? Principle number 2, there'll be lots of advice at any checklist that you look at about the legal and sort of admin side of how to handle this situation. But when I looked, I could find limited advice about how to handle the grieving process that you, your team, and the organisation will go through. So that's principle number 2. The first thing to understand, I suppose, is the sort of individual reactions and realities that you're going to experience. One of the difficult questions is whether you or the company is going to be held responsible for what happened. That's a tough question to answer. So make sure you start getting your head around that. It was a question we had to answer, and our response to that was to do the right thing and investigate what had happened in an objective fashion. To what extent can we learn something from these lessons? But I would urge you to think about that, because people that are grieving are very angry and they want someone to blame, and that quickly can become you. So make sure that you're clear in your own mind how you're going to get to those answers. Also, pay attention to the grieving process that you'll see both in teams and as individuals. So we found that if we weren't careful, we told people what had happened and then it didn't get mentioned again. And so we actually hosted what we crudely called listening circles. So we told people that we would be in a room and that we were going to be talking about the person that we'd lost, and that they were welcome to come along, whether as a manager to ask questions or whether as a colleague who wanted to talk about the person they'd lost, to make sure that we kept that person alive. Pay particular attention to the people that are feeling guilty. With one of my individuals, a member of my team had noticed that he was struggling, had tried to get him to go for help, and he resisted. And so naturally, the question she was asking is, what more should I have done, and why didn't I do it? That's a very corrosive journey for someone to be on, and get them extra support and help, and make sure you do that well. It's really tempting to have a counsellor on hand because it makes you feel like you're doing something, and it's also a really visible sign that the company cares. My personal experience is very few people went to see them, and I experimented with having that person sit in different parts of the building, thinking maybe it was because of where she was, but it wasn't. I found that we needed to use different sources of support to get people that help. We also looked for ways to celebrate life. So whether that was a condolence book, a ceremony, some sort of charity donation, and actually those became part of how we worked, because actually we did those things often each year, just to make sure that people knew we hadn't forgotten. And that became really important, certainly to one of the families that I spoke to. And the final thing, I suppose, is really for you to pay attention to yourselves and your own team. So, as I described at the beginning, everyone turned to me and said, what do we do? For one of my cases, I felt deeply shameful when actually I stood up to announce what had happened to 200 people and burst into tears. It's not a comfortable state for me to be in. I'm someone who is well known for being very resilient and strong. And so how do I look after myself during that period? Before lunch, Mandy mentioned supervision, and I would advocate that in HR, that's actually something we should invest in ourselves, and I certainly did during this period. So, think about what embracing this grieving process means for you. Off you go, 1 minute each way, have a conversation with your colleague. If I can ask you to stop there. I feel terrible stopping people from talking. It sounds like you're having a good conversation. I hope you carry it on after we've finished. So what's the third principle? Well, the third principle was to understand the deeper patterns. So I think if you're paying attention, events like these ask you to think about what else is going on in your organisation. and that was certainly true for us. They gave us the opportunity to get additional insight about what we were doing and what we weren't, and what that meant for us. And I think for the employees affected, that was helping them to create some sort of meaning and purpose out of what we'd experienced. So whether that's through an investigation that you do, informally or formally, or actually through the inquiry that you lead in an organisation, these are things that can help illuminate what's been going on. We weren't satisfied that we'd done enough. And so, as many other speakers have described today, we invited some volunteers to come together to see if there was more that we could do. But we started by wanting to understand. That group naturally wanted to share their own stories of mental health and ill health with each other. And from that conversation, we would start to look at some of the things that we needed to change. In the sort of media industry specifically, alcohol and drugs is a common feature of how people live, survive, work and play. And so we chose to tackle that and did some education for our managers to help them understand what that looked like, abuse of those substances, what it looked like, and actually what to say if they noticed it. Because actually we discovered that managers may have noticed it, but they didn't know where to start in terms of actually saying something. We also did, with March on Stress, Neil Greenberg is here today and he'll talk about this later, but we actually embarked on a straw programme looking at how we could provide peer support. Belinda mentioned it in her opening speech this morning, that we know that people are more likely to tell their colleagues than they are to tell anybody else. And so we actually equipped people from across the teams to actually be in a position to look for distress and know what to do about it. And those allowed us to start thinking about what we'd missed or what we could do better. So again, have a two-way conversation for just a minute each to think about what does understanding deeper patterns mean for you. So, as a reminder, hopefully I've told you a little something about my story and my experience. It's not something I've ever spoken about before, and so I hope my lived experience has been useful for you. As I say, 3 key principles: choreograph communications, take care of the grieving process, and think about the deeper patterns. I'm going to hand you over to Neil? No. Nick, who's going to talk about, it's always going to happen, who's going to talk about what he does.
Thank you. Thank you. So often I think we learn so much. Carrie, thank you. There's so much we learn in life through hard-won experience, and that's what I'm hearing you share today. Why am I qualified to talk about this subject? Hard-won experience, I think a lot of us have hard-won experience with suicide. I can identify when I was a teenager. I had some experience of thinking of suicide and doing what we would call suicide behavior. I recovered from that. And as an adult then professionally got involved in helping other people. And in the advice sector, in my first year of working for an organisation called Shelter, I had people coming to me who were in acute housing need. They were losing their homes or they were homeless, in huge pain. And I very, very quickly realised people came to me thinking of suicide. And I found myself talking about suicide, having never, ever had any training or education around suicide at all. I was about 31. It got me involved, and it motivated me to get educated. And I got to learn a lot and understand a lot about why people think, and sometimes people do suicide, but also how to prevent suicide. And one of the things I learned through getting involved in education, because my career developed and I began teaching, not just social welfare, actually suicide prevention. But they taught me, people thinking about suicide don't want their lives to end, they want the pain to stop. And then I realized through learning, do you know, they let others know. So the signs, well, sometimes people would say they were never signs. But they said, well, how would you know if you'd never been trained to know what the signs were? So there were three things. They don't want their lives to end. They want the pain to stop. So they let others know. And that taught us that, do you know what, if I respond the right way, if someone's letting me know, most suicides could be prevented. And that was a key message that kind of informs a lot of our work. Just moving forwards from those core beliefs, safety is a target when we work with people. And embedding safety into the culture of organizations is a lot of why we're here today. If we had the attitude, suicide, you know what, eventually someone's going to die, well, that's a really common attitude that you come across in lots of different sectors, that suicide's inevitable. And it is an attitude that actually we can change, because I could go to the other side and think about airlines and ask you to think about why it's so difficult to get into Terminal 5 right now. Go back to the 1980s, we had an air disaster in the UK that changed the face of airline safety. The consequence of that airline disaster in 1988 was that the airline ended 4 or 5 years later. Well, a death by suicide can have huge implications for everyone involved, but we believe it's one of the most preventable deaths. So thinking about safety in your organization, we're talking about education. And of course, we know mental health and well-being programs. 10 years ago, one of our colleagues, Jonathan Nace, set up Stand to Reason, which was one of the first mental health well-being charities that did some fantastic work with corporates 10 years ago. But suicide prevention back then was like a little element of those programs. The outcomes were great. People felt more comfortable talking about mental health. Remember, only 2%, our statistic from this morning, only 2% of people would be comfortable speaking to their HR about their mental health. Well, imagine then speaking about suicide. If only two in 100 people would be comfortable talking about mental health, how many would be comfortable telling their HR executive that suicide was what they were thinking of? So creating the conditions is what we do, the conditions for people to feel okay to talk. And that's about education and training. So we've done training with different corporates. The outcomes, of course, are that a culture change occurs. If you implement a training program into an organization, do you know what? Courage is infectious. And actually knowing that it's okay to tell is really helpful, because we're scared of telling others. We're scared of letting others know. Unconsciously, we can let others know. Consciously, well, do you know what? Not everybody thinking of suicide will be standing on a bridge. Actually, I can consciously do things to let you know. How will you respond? Because we're scared of telling, but of course, you're scared of asking. And actually, there's an interesting, if you think about this, that's a fatal combination. So actually asking about suicide is key, and that's part of what I learned. I've been talking about suicide for 10 years on a daily basis, and I hope I never stop being touched by suicide, because it touches me every time I talk about it. What is more serious than life and death? Actually, this should touch me. Okay, well, we learned asking is key, but, well, how would you respond if someone said, yes, I am thinking of suicide? Gosh, they've just thrown you a big ball, and you've never been trained to hold that ball, and it's uncomfortable, and I'm scared of dropping that ball, and I want to give that ball to someone else, but I've been left, and I'm holding it. How would you know if you'd never been trained? So what we've done in the last year is talk about qualifying people in this subject. For 10 years, we've had mental health first aid training. It's had fantastic outcomes across different sectors across the country. We're talking about mandatory training in mental health across multiple sectors. There's a conversation beginning now Why does suicide prevention training, suicide prevention education have to be kind of snuck in the back door? Actually, the stigma around suicide prevails, and it's only by talking about it that we can begin to break down that stigma. When we set up questions, are we going to move to questions? Okay, absolutely with you.
I'm going to help you facilitate the questions. Okay. I didn't mean to interrupt, but I'm just conscious of time, and I know people are going to have questions. So if anybody does have questions, now's the opportunity to go onto Slido, and we've got some questions coming in. We'll just wait a few minutes in case people are doing things now. I'm sure you're all familiar with the platform. If you want to open up the site and put in your questions, that would be great. Yes, we've got lots of questions. So, just looking at them before we, just to have a quick look. Carrie, the first one. I'm going to read it to you, don't worry. So somebody has asked, what are the actions you need to take when an employee tells you they have suicidal thoughts? What ongoing support do they need? I might actually ask both of you that one, Carrie, to start.
Well, I think Nick beautifully describes the fact that first the question is, did you ask, and what answer did you get? But also, what do you do with it now? I mean, having had that happen to me, the first thing I do is find out what routes to support this person's got, and what routes they're prepared to take, whether that's to go into a treatment facility, to go to a counsellor, to talk to the Samaritans. So for me, the first question is always, what support have they got, what support are they getting, and what are they open to? That would be my first question.
And Nick? You might go on to actually another question for you, Nick, actually, about awareness training before people enter the workforce. Are you aware of anything for schools investigating around this subject? Any training on that subject?
Awareness training around suicide has been evolving for 15 years in the UK. There's different programs that are age appropriate for pupils, so for children. And then, of course, there's training for teachers. Something that was said by Carrie that just resonated with me while she was speaking was around blame and the blame culture after someone's died. For me, my protection around that accusation is how I respond and knowing I'm qualified to respond the right way. So our work with schools has been around qualifying teachers in suicide prevention. I know that I'm quality marked in my performance, and I micro-record whenever I work with suicide, which is subject to scrutiny. And that's a great way of working with children and young people.
It's interesting because we've had a session on men and mental health that some of you may have been in, but there's a session here about the results there's very high statistics for men specifically. And so this question here, is there such a thing as gender-specific training awareness? Do you feel that needs to be implemented? Nick, I'll ask you that.
So Campaign Against Living Miserably has been doing fantastic work, again, for the past 10 years or so, working with gender, with men. So they do fantastic gender-specific training. There's all sorts of initiatives kind of around the country working with gender. And I think, it's worthy just going online and looking at the types of initiatives that are happening in the UK around male suicide.
My final question, I think, Carrie. Following suicide, there will usually be an inquest. Should the internal investigation be conducted before or after?
Your legal advisor will give you proper advice about this, because that was a question I had. My experience of the inquest wasn't they weren't trying to find out whose fault it was. They were trying to find out what had happened, the facts of the case. Our investigation was legally privileged because we didn't necessarily want to divulge it into a public setting, partly out of respect for the family. But what we did do is publicly share what we thought it showed us in a letter to all of our staff, because we'd committed to look into it and we committed to share the results with them. somebody from our organisation did go to the inquest and that wasn't something they wanted to include or consider.
Thank you, everyone. We're going to conclude this session now. Hugely powerful session.